Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Two Rivers Reading Series author event this afternoon. We're very pleased to have a special guest faculty member reading today. The Two Rivers Reading Series is sponsored by the English Division and, of course, the Reading Series Committee, whose members include Paige Reel, Michelle Herron, Scott Stanke, Tracy Youngblom-Turner, and myself, Kathy White. We are very pleased to welcome author and English faculty member Kate Kaiser to campus today. Before we get into our introduction of Kate, though, I would like to let everybody know that after we meet at 1 o'clock until about 1:30, we'll be offering information about the creative writing on campus, and it will be over there, and there will be food and beverage as well. So please think about staying after this wonderful event and asking questions and collecting copies of the Rapids Review and information sheets from various creative writing classes. And please, if everyone would just turn off your telephones. Catherine Kaiser will be reading from and discussing her book of poems, Pretend the World. Pretend the World is filled with both the personal and the political, in poems that explore subjects as far-ranging as nature, cultural identity, sexuality, and motherhood. Poet Dorianne Locks notes that the poems in her book radiate a lyric vitality, and indeed they do. And the Poetry Foundation declares the poems offer a gripping but blunt way of seeing the lives we create, the wars we wage, the things we consume, and the connections we make without overbearing sentimentality. It is a very beautiful book, as you can see here. And after the reading, Kate will be sitting in front and signing books. Kate Kaiser has published an earlier collection of poetry, Dark Lake, which I noticed there's a copy of up here. And I would imagine that it is available in the bookstore. She also edited a collection of essays, Riding Shotgun, Women Write About Their Mothers. Her writing has received numerous awards, including fellowships from the Minnesota State Arts Board, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Anderson Center for Interdisciplinary Studies. And now, please welcome to the podium, Catherine Kaiser.
I'm really honored to be here. About 15 years ago, Scott Stanke, Patty Wheeler Andrews, a couple other faculty started inviting authors to come to Anoka Ramsey. And we found that students really enjoyed the readings a little bit more if they had read the book. So this was sort of the beginning of the Two Rivers Reading Series. So over the 15 years it's grown, and it's just a thrill for me to be invited back here as a guest. I have a request. I'm going to start with the first poem from my first book. Elaine Kenny is here. She's a graduate from our AA and Creative Writing program. She will be here to talk to students about what it's like to go through our program at the 1 o'clock session, if you can hang around. And the poem that she asked for is very fitting because it's my Bruce Springsteen poem, and I just got to see Bruce Springsteen on Sunday night. So this is an oldie but a goodie. It's the first poem from Dark Lake, Escape from Paradise, Iowa. We are afraid of nothing. At the diner, you order a burger, a grilled cheese for me. We tell bad jokes, pour salt on the table. The waitress glares at us, our clothes too tight, my lipstick too red for this small town. This is the summer of anger and beer. We know everything. How each blade of grass turns in the wind, why the sunlight glints off the pool, the shining of streetlights on black pavement, the darkness of the lake at night. At the bar, you say, I am as Nordic as blonde hair, the sheet under my skin, a frame for your thoughts. I am the only one smoking. My breath peels into the air like waves. We have nothing in this town. A beat-up Mustang, a few songs on the jukebox, the torn cover of a book you never read. When we get in the car, you pass me another beer. We are scared of these random roads, the small towns passing, the gas tank nearly empty. My head on your shoulder, the A-track stuck again. We're gonna drive this dirt road all the way to Kansas City. Garrison Keillor read that poem, and you can hear that on the Writer's Almanac website. He also put that recently in his collection, American Poems, American Places, something like that. So I'll segue to the first poem of the book that you have looked at, Pretend the World. And the first poem of a book should sort of be like a title in some ways. It should sort of open the themes to you, kind of give a hint of what's coming. And so last October on page 3, how many of you have books? I'll let you know the pages in case you want to read along. At poetry readings, you know what? I don't read along. I close my eyes and I listen. You can do either one. But this poem, though it's short, it introduces some of the themes in the book. Last October. The umber light slants through leaves like flute notes fading in the distance. The goose, fat and heavy at the lake's edge, is the weight of war in a mother's heart. A husk, a silence, a muffled cry, while the light lies undisturbed on the horizon. So this poem introduces some of the themes in the book of nature, of motherhood, of war, this kind of stillness, and yet there's something rumbling underneath that. One poem a lot of people asked about was my poem Early Spring Dark Lake on page 55. It's near the end of the book. It's another nature poem, and people were confused. They said, why is this poem all over the page? And actually it was all over the page even more than this when I originally wrote it. I had to shrink it a little bit for the book. But it's about the ice fragmenting on a lake at the beginning of the spring in northern Minnesota. So listen and see if you can think of why it's kind of fragmented in its shape. Early Spring Dark Lake, 1997. The morning birds outside the window at the feeder savor the rusty burnt cookie, chirping the deep brown cries of northern winter nearly over. They sing of leaves, birch, rock, and spirit. I get out the map and paintbrush, rewrite the landscape as it unveils in the morning light. The birds flit across the lake, covered with ice and snow, edged with elms and oak, stone and grass. The sun and moon seem to touch as the wind grips the last dream-scented house next to the cracking ice. The horses toss their angry yellow manes. The land is a shell opening. Have any of you had the joy of being up in northern Minnesota or next to a lake when it's starting to unfreeze? It booms, it cracks, these huge, huge noises, so it's very, very powerful. I'm very influenced by northern Minnesota by nature. There's a lot of nature poems in here, and landscape plays greatly in my thoughts. The poem across from Early Spring Dark Lake on page 54, Hand Sisters, is another poem, and this is a poem about my origins. It's also a tribute to my friend Heide Erdrich, because our hands, even though our faces and our bodies don't look much alike, our hands are exactly the same size and length. So this is about our hands. Hand Sisters for Heide. Our hands trace the same path, length of fingers, broad knuckles, the curved nail of the thumb. Our hands fit together as cousins in flat, dry lands of distant buttes, sagebrush, and a big wide sky that devours birds, displays the sun and moon as a centerpiece to all. Our sisters' hands fit ours, hands descended from Nebraska, North Dakota, Idaho, flat-fielded land, prairie land, almost desert at times. These hands, gifts from knife-wielding butchers, steak-pounding railroad workers, hold our German daring, your Ojibwe generosity and wit. These hands are big and capable, strong and wise, long fingers able to grasp the words we desire, plucked from a cacophony of sounds, of flight, of light, to build the stories that lead us back to the land back to our grandfathers, back home. I'll read just a couple more and then start with some of your questions. I'll read a poem about my grandfather since I'm on that topic. It's called German. It's on page 14. And although some of this poem is true, some of it is not. For those of you that are writers, you know sometimes once you start writing something, it may have a seed, it may have a trigger, but it grows into something else. So some of these details are true and some of them are not. Nobody in my family, none of my relatives, I don't think have read it, so nobody's complained to me yet. It's called German. During the First World War, my great-grandparents burned all the German books except the Bible, which they hid wrapped in canvas in the root cellar. They would not speak German, even in hushed tones at home. Grandma strove to enunciate each word clearly, to memorize English poems she could tick from her tongue like cards from a dealer's hand. They stopped making strudel, Lebkuchen, spätzle, and springele, and instead cooked green beans until blanched pale, casseroles with pronounceable names ending in hot dish to be served in the Methodist church basement. During the Second World War, there were no concentration camps in Idaho, though Godhelf Wilhelm, or GW as he was known, feared when from his dusty tenement farm he saw the Japanese and sometimes the Chinese by mistake rounded up. Saved by the color of his skin, if he kept his mouth shut, his head down, the irrigation water turned high every Thursday, church on Sunday, the store on Saturday morning, they could pretend to be safe. But at home, he had coins in jars beneath the floorboards, on the attic rafters, behind the canned tomatoes in the cupboard. He was ready for another depression, another draft, a war. He was always waiting, alert, ready, knowing he was the little guy, knowing bankers owned his land, knowing his tongue revealed his origins, knowing politics could change and he would once again be the one they had to blame to make the rest of the country feel safe. So one of the themes that floats through the book is this idea of safety, pretending things are okay, pretending that everybody's safe. As I became a parent, I found out you often have to pretend everything's okay when it's not. Oh, that's just a siren going off to warn us to go to the basement. There's no real problem with the tornado. Let's go down to the basement. And although I might be scared, I can't let on to that. And so a lot of the book is about the surface of things being okay and things underneath it not necessarily being all right. One of those expressions of fear, a slight fear, comes out in my poem, Dresses Everywhere. And about a year and a half ago, I had an art exhibit at Banfield Center for the Arts in Fridley, just south of here on River Road. And there was 5 artists that made art in response to the poems in the book. And if you go to my website, I think you can still see some of the pictures of some of those pieces of art they made. And Philip Noyet, a friend of mine who's a painter and a sculptor, made this giant light, and it had a light bulb in the middle, and then it was like a world, the shape of a world, and all these little wires poking with pictures of little dresses everywhere, and at the bottom there was a pair of pants hanging at the very bottom. So you'll find out why that pair of pants is at the bottom here. And this poem follows a trajectory from my grandmother to my mother to myself to my daughter. So it's kind of that link of my family as you go through the 4 stanzas. The presents for my baby daughter arrive in the mail for her spring birthday. Dresses with buttons and bows, flowers and lace, sometimes with matching panties. In her wide stance wobble, she navigates the rooms, walking, then falling, getting caught in the hems as she crawls forward, tries to stand again, her pudgy white legs so vulnerable, her diapered bottom exposed. My mother could not be seen in pants. If a farmer drove down the road, dust plume and puttering pickup announcing his arrival, she'd run to the barn and hide, or pull a dress fresh from laundering off the line as she hurried to the outhouse to change, not to be seen in pants. My grandmother's rules about legs, thank you notes, and hemlines holding her tightly in place. My elementary school had a rule that girls had to wear dresses. I wore thick green corduroy pants to school to warm my legs as I waited in line with the safety patrols, removing them in the damp, smelling wood-paneled cloakroom, hanging them on a blackened hook, greased by the hands of a century of children before me, my bruised and skinny legs sticking out of the short dress, two cold white sticks in winter. Now for my daughter's favorite made-up song is Dresses Everywhere. She sings it in a tuneless voice, the lyrics changing each time. Her dresses must be pink and purple with bows and lace, frills and big white collars. At school, she rolls in grass, makes mud cakes decorated with elm seeds, digs deep holes in the sand because dirt is so cuddly, Mommy. I long for the day when she'll prefer pants, cover her silky long legs with dense blue fabric to keep her safe, protected, clean, unharmed. Let's see. Why don't we start with some questions? I'd love it if you have some questions. Yes?
In one of those poems that you read from Pretend the World, it was titled, had 1997 in it. That was, I'm wondering why that wasn't included in the Dark Lake one. Like, did you make a decision that it fit better with those poems from the second collection? Or?
Well, that's probably an editing error on the part of the editor and the writer. Because the poems literally do go around the world. They go backwards in time, they go to Eastern Europe, there's a poem in China, I'll read you a poem in China. And I needed to cue the reader as to where they were in time and space. And so a lot of the poems just have a little marking, place and time. And that's just to let people know where they are. Otherwise, I think it would have been too jolting for folks. So I do want to read that one from China. Can we do that? The reason I wrote that one, it's inspected by number 5, is for 2 reasons. Number 1, I took the first group of students from Anoka Ramsey to Jiaoqing, to our sister school program in Jiaoqing in 1996, I think it was, 95, 96, 97, something like that. And I met a lot of students at our exchange school whose families were working in Guangzhou at those big factories that are making our clothes and making our iPhones and making our iPads. There was a couple other triggers for this poem. I ordered a lot of clothes from Land's End for my kids when they were smaller. And one time my daughter got a package and it said inspected by number 5. And I knew enough about these people in southern China to wonder, well, who is number 5? Who might number 5 be? So some students have been asking me, what's my inspiration for writing? And I'm not necessarily so much inspired as confused and wondering about things. And this was one of the poems I was wondering about. Who is number 5 and what might Inspector number 5's life be like? And so this is based in part then on a documentary I saw called China Blue, my conversations with the students in Jiaoqing, and some of this is my imagining. This is on page 37, inspected by number 5. On Saturday nights, I walk arm in arm with Li Hong to tease the night merchants, drink noodle soup, and look at clothes, radios, and ice cream. 6 days a week, we sweat in the dusty warehouse, no windows, just a few lazy fans. We wipe the sweat on our sleeves and dream of Mama and Baba in the countryside farming a bit of land. I want to try for a modern life, to get ahead, to buy a TV for Didi. No men here, only the foreman, and a dormitory filled with girls like me, dreaming of rice with no pebbles, vegetables with chunks of tofu, a steamed fish, jowls of plump with ground spiced pork. We lived 12 girls to a room, beds stacked 3 high. Li Hong and I perch like birds in a tree in our private nests. Li Hong collects letters from her grammar school sweetheart. She works for her dowry. I send small checks to Lao Jia, saving enough for vegetable dumplings for myself. I am number 5, the checker. I inspect the seams, the pocket linings, and the hem. We are making underwear and undershirts for little girls, pink and blue patterns, pure and shining white. Will they fit just right, bringing happiness to the brown-haired girl in Italy, the golden-haired girl in Canada, I tuck in my note, my secret message, inspected by number 5. So that one didn't tell you where you were in time and space, but hopefully it painted a picture so you kind of imagined that. There's some other questions. Yes?
How did you come up with the cover?
How did I come up with the cover? Well, I did not, this is not my painting. I am not a gifted artist. That's why I'm a writer, because I failed in both pottery and visual arts and theater and everything else. But this is an image by a young local painter named Julie Buffalohead, and she lives in St. Paul. And normally writers don't get to choose their covers. So for instance, when I was negotiating my anthology writing Shotgun, the very first conversation I had with the editor, she said, you will not get to choose the title, you will not get to choose the cover. And that's true for most books. And the bigger the publisher, the more control they want over the cover, the marketing, what it looks like. Poetry books aren't big sellers, and so publishers don't care quite so much. But I had come out of that experience of not getting any control over my book cover and title to having the publisher email me and said, you need to pick your cover and your title in the next week and a half. And I was just totally in shock. I didn't know what to do. So I emailed my friend Heidi Erdrich, who works with artists. She's an arts curator, amongst other things, as well as a writer. And I said, help, what am I going to do? So she sent me some links to some artists' websites. And I had known Julie's work, but then I came across this image and I really liked it. There's multiple reasons. First of all, you see the woman has the mask on, the wolf mask. And the word persona means mask in Greek. And so there's many persona poems, especially in the second section of the book. So I thought that that image of the woman wearing the mask kind of lets you know a little bit about the book. It's also the woman sleeping, the woman dreaming, the woman imagining. And she has a world within her, doesn't she, because she's pregnant. There's also this audience of the trees and the animals silently standing around her, looking at her. So although the piece of art was made totally separately from the book, I thought that the piece of art commented on some of the themes. And I also kind of thought it was a feminist statement to put a pregnant woman on the cover. Garrison Keillor did 4 poems out of this book, and he's done none from this book, and I still sometimes wonder if he doesn't like the cover. And that's why he didn't pick up the book. But I also thought that that was important as well. So I liked a lot of things about it. So I was very lucky to get to choose it. I did not come up with the title myself. I was at a writer's residency at the Anderson Center in Red Wing. A writer's residency is a place where you go and they feed you and they house you. It's wonderful. And you get to just write or paint or draw, whatever your art form is. And the last time I was at the Anderson Center, there was a novelist there, and she was helping me out. She read my manuscript, and she picked that phrase, pretending to be safe, out of the German poem that I read for you, and said, you know, this is this theme. You know, the kids are playing, the kids are pretending, but the adults are also pretending as well here. So that theme kind of linked things up. So it was going to be Pretending the World, and then everybody said, oh no, the ing is dead. Nobody does book titles with ing anymore. So we shortened it to Pretend the World. But yes, I was very lucky to have such a lovely painting on the cover. I was thrilled. And it was also nice to have an editor that let me be involved in that process. Other questions? Yes?
What inspired you to publish the book, with your poems in a book?
So that I could get on to writing the next book? I don't know. I guess once you start writing and you get a lot of poems, I mean, I had a lot of poems when I published this book. I kind of wanted to launch them out into the world, have people read them. It's a thrill to have other people read them. And then after the first book, then you just get in the habit of it, I guess. And I wanted to send the poems out into this book. I don't know. And I think after you write long enough, most people like to have a book. It's nice. It's easier than handing people sheaves of paper. Other questions? Yes?
Why poems? Why not like other stories?
Why poems? Because I'm really bad at plot. I have tried writing short stories, and I invent wonderful characters, and I describe these fabulous places, and then something has to happen, and then I invent more characters, and I invent more places. I was trying to write a novel at one point, and it was sort of like a Robert Altman film. I mean, there was just more and more people and more places, and it didn't make sense at all. I don't have a real good ear for dialogue. I'm more of a visual person. I think you can sense that from reading some of my poems. So I'm not as auditory, so I'm not real good with dialogue, and I'm not particularly good with plot. I do write nonfiction. I do write some short articles. I'm thinking of working on a memoir, thinking about it, not sure. And I'm also working on another collection of poetry. My dad has late-stage Alzheimer's, and so I'm thinking a lot about memory and remembering as he's losing his memory, and I'm kind of getting to be at the age where I'm remembering and looking back at my past a lot. I'm looking at those two threads. So I think you may, in the future, see maybe another book of poetry and maybe a memoir from me, but probably not any fiction. Other questions? These are great. Yes?
Did you put the poems in your book in a specific order?
That's a great question. The question is, did I put the poems in the book in a specific order? Absolutely. Because I didn't know any better on my first book, I just organized them chronologically. So you start with me driving around drinking beer, smoking cigarettes, and there's less and less cigarettes and beer and more food as you go through the poem, as you go through the book. But this book kind of ends with some pregnancy poems. It ends with my children being born. And so it was kind of the greatest hits of my work until that point. Then the second book then is, again, the best poems from when that first book was published until now. But I didn't want to publish them chronologically. I really wanted to create more of an arc, more of a narrative thread to pull the reader through the book. So if you look at the book, if you have one in front of you, if you don't, that's okay. It's organized into Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. So that idea of a play being reflected in the poems, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, is a reflection of the pretending, of the artifice. But also there's different distinct sections. The first section starts out with some kind of quieter poems, some childhood poems, and it moves more and more into some disturbing situations, ending with cutting thread about the Iraq War. The second section is some of the persona poems, and that poem really does go around the world. The Chinese poem that I read you is in there. And then Act 3 comes back and focuses more on the author, the individual, and sort of ends on a happy note with the writer sort of happy alone towards the end of the book. So hopefully there's a narrative thread, there's an arc, a bit of a plot, some kind of movement as you move through it. It may or may not work. I didn't necessarily come up with all of this myself. I worked with two editors, Jim Perlman, who owns Holy Cow Press, as well as Jim Seelar, an independent editor who used to be at Milkweed Editions. And I worked with both of them to edit the book. And one of the things I have to say to you, if you're a writer, is you never stop needing people to help you edit. You can always learn, you can always improve. And having your classmates, having your writers group, having your teachers read your work and help you learn how to edit is very, very important. So hopefully there's a thoughtful structure to the book, but I don't know if it worked for you or not. Yes?
Do you like one of the three acts better than the other two, or is there a favorite? Because they are themes.
The question is if I like one of the three sections of the book more than the other. That's like asking me if I like one of my kids better than the other one. You know, I think they all have their strengths. As I've talked to students at Anoka Ramsey the last couple of days, people seem to like Act 1 the best, and I think that may be because there's some childhood poems in there. There's some more of the narrative poems, some of the more accessible poems, I think, are in Act 1. Act 3 may have some more of the fragmented, more aesthetically challenging poems to them, but I can't really say if I like one or the other better. I like them all. I think they all have flaws. Just like my kids. Yes?
Yeah, a lot of your poems, you have very different layouts. Is that something you choose to do when you're writing it, or do you kind of go back and change how you like the look of it when you're finishing it up and putting it in the book?
The question is about the structure of the poem. A lot of the poems have different looks, and when in the writing process do I do that. If I was smart, I would write the poem and get all the words settled and then start messing around with the structure. But I do that organically. I go back and forth. And so I will write, and then I'll edit the structure, and then I'll write, and then I'll edit. My poems usually take almost at least a year to write, sometimes longer. And part of that is that so that I can switch from the writing hat to the editing hat. I know those of you in a creative writing class may not have that much time. You only have 4 months. But it does take a while. And so sometimes after I write it, I'll let it sit in the computer for a while and then come back to it and then start to mess with the shape and the structure. So for instance, the Early Spring Dark Lake, that's all fragmented and all over the place, I wrote that poem when I was working on Dark Lake, but it wasn't done yet. It really wasn't ready. There was something wrong with it. And when I finally discovered the fragmentation of the shape, it seemed to fit the poem better. So I play around with it. Ultimately, ideally, the structure of the poem would reflect the content. That's not always the case. The structure can also create rhythm as well. It can pull you through the poem. It can slow you down. It can give you cues as to how to read the poem. So there's many different ways to do that. So I intentionally tried to set up a variety of different shapes and structures in the book.
In two of your poems you have in Salvation and Reverend Tennyson Comes to Call, you're depicting pastors. Both seem to be losing love or looking in the wrong places. What sparked that?
The question is both, and that's a very astute question, in Salvation and in, what's the other one?
Reverend Tennyson.
Reverend Tennyson Comes to Call. There's pastors in both of those. My dad and my stepmom are ministers. They're Lutheran pastors, so I don't know if that had any influence over it. But those are both historical poems. And the Reverend Tennyson Comes to Call is actually based on some historical stories I read about Mackinac Island. And I don't know where the character of Reverend Tennyson actually came from. So I don't quite know how that got in there. And then the story for Salvation is an odd one in that very rarely do I get kind of the whole poem. But that poem was sort of just told to me. I just sort of heard the voice. I wrote it down. It's a young girl's voice. And the structure for that one is this long, skinny poem. You know, kids just sort of talk fast and this and this and this and this and this. And so I tried to sort of pull the reader through the poem with that long, skinny structure. So that one didn't go through much revision, but most of them usually do. The Reverend Tennyson Comes to Call did go through a lot of revision. So why did these two pastors show up as characters in the book? I don't know. I don't know. Yes?
In contrast, there is a poem, and I think if I could, that makes reference to witchcraft, like a children's game.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering,
Little Witches?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What the context for that is.
You guys are seeing all kinds of deep religious things in the book that I didn't intend to. That's not necessarily a reference to witchcraft. So it's just funny.
Where did it come from? Did it have, what's the story behind it? It's sort of messed up.
It really doesn't have a particular story. One of the things that a poet sometimes does is puts together images and ideas that sound good, that are interesting, and we want to leave the poem open to the reader and have multiple meanings and multiple intentions. And so this is one of those poems I think you can read in multiple ways, but it's not necessarily a nod towards witchcraft at all. So. Yes?
What caused you to write last October where it's like separate the way it is, and then you can read it both ways, either up and down or side to side?
So she's talking about the structure of Last October. There's 2 columns of poetry, and you can read each column or you can read it all together. Again, that was just part of some of my experimentation with looking at some different ways to read the poem. So just like Little Witches, you can read that one in multiple ways. That's a poem about experimentation and playing, exploration. You can experiment and play and explore as you read that poem as well by looking at different ways to read it. So. Yes?
I've noticed a lot of your poems have to do with personal experiences. Is
Mhm.
there like a reason why you started writing about war?
Is there a reason I started writing about war and I write about a lot about personal experiences? I was upset about the Iraq War when it started. My husband's a physician, and he came home one day with the the amount of money we spent on the 8 days of shock and awe bombing could have given everybody in sub-Saharan Africa AIDS medication for 30 years. I always imagine what would have happened if we'd spent all that money on creating schools for people, if we had dropped rice on people instead of bombs. So that was something I was thinking about a lot. And the poem, let's read that one. The poem where I'm thinking about that, I'm hanging out in my kitchen and feeling kind of guilty, is Under the Plastic Tarp on page 21. And so here, while there was all these people suffering, and don't you feel this now when you keep hearing about people on the East Coast with no electricity? They still have no electricity, they still have no water, they have to have their houses inspected, and everything's getting moldy in their homes. And then here you go home and you turn on the water and you turn on the stove and you've got all this refrigerator full of food. And so part of this is about feeling guilty and feeling helpless. What can we do? We can give money to the Red Cross to help people on the East Coast right now, but is that really enough? So let's look at that poem. It's Under the Plastic Tarp. In the first days of the war, she comes to me, her face on the front page of my newspaper. She is caring for her husband, her sick 6-month-old baby, living on a rocky ledge under a sheet of plastic outside of Baghdad. She has a dented pot, a blue plastic bucket with dirty water, city clothes and not enough blankets, her breast milk getting thin as she waits for the bombs to come and go, white rock dust smeared on the staring blank face of her older wide-eyed child. I sipped my coffee. All over the world, women are turning on burners or blowing on a few dried twigs, flames for food, warmth and sustenance, not shock and awe. We are linked by fire and water, pots of steaming grain and warm toasted bread, the hungry eyes and mouths of waiting children. My daughter plucks down her crust and joyously announces, "I'm done, I'm full." She carries her plastic bunny plate to the sink and returns to the basement to play camping with her brother, cooking soup on a pretend fire, sleeping on a pile of couch pillows and hairy dog blankets. Pretending the world is safe, I close the paper and rinse white china in a stream of clear, clean liquid, trail slow circles with a soapy sponge, haunted by the woman under the plastic tarp. So you can hear some of those words and some of those themes in that poem, the pretending. Here my kids are pretending to go camping when this woman on the front page of the newspaper is really camping, except without any camping gear. And I'm thinking, all that woman wants to do is cook breakfast for her kids. In the same way I'm cooking breakfast for my kids. And here I have this clean, clear water, and my daughter's full, and those children are not. So part of what the reason war comes up a lot in here then is, again, that sometimes we're safe and sometimes we're not. And sometimes it's unfair that we're safe and other people are not. And so that goes back to my grandfather. Actually, my great-grandfather immigrated from Germany to get away from the Kaiser's army. And so there's this thread of pacifism and concern about war through my family. Might be those Lutheran ministers that keep showing up in the book. I've got time for about 1 or 2 more questions. Well, why don't we go to some of the happier poems near the end of the book. And I was telling you a little bit about the Anderson Center. Why don't I read the last two poems in the book on page 56 and 57, so you can get a little bit more of the feel for the nature of poems, and then kind of how the book comes to peace at the end, after dealing with religion, after dealing with war, after dealing with this issue of safety and pretending about that. Return to Lake Superior. In late August, romp through the path, in late August, stomp on the path through matted grass, the dark woods. Run on the shore and make all the stars sing. There isn't a bud or berry, changing, moving, glistening. Out in the open again, hear the harp of darkness sing. Damp air caresses your face, strokes your snow-white feathers. Crimson curls a leaf's edge. A deer crosses the road in the fog behind you. The earth reminds you, we are all learning to leave. And then this is the last poem of the book, which I hope ends everything on a happy note. At the Anderson Center, Red Wing, 2006. I don't flirt with the printmaker or look longingly at the photos of the visiting Manchurian artist. I eat alone, pine away the hours with tea, ginger cookies, baths in the steaming hot water, for the rich baron who built this house was long and lean and insisted on inventing things that could fly. Walking by the river, brown bluffs, ditch water green with duckweed even in the cold, rabbits, red willow woven with straw-colored vines, the rose sunset in the eddies of the curving pond. Here is the moon now, almost full, looking bitten and asymmetrical, as if she'd had a hard night with her lover, but still came to see me anyway. I leave cool footprints in the white winter snow. Sure, I have a sore throat and a fever, and yes, the wine is getting to my head, but my heart feels a happiness, drunk and satisfied like an ancient Chinese poet. These things are so good, the moon, the wine, the silent place, the hills just behind the sky. So I want to thank you for inviting me, and also extend an invitation to you. We will be talking about the creative writing programs and classes here from 1 o'clock to 1:30. We've got alumni that are here to meet with you. We've got most of the faculty of our creative writing classes, and there will be cookies.
And we have Kate Kaiser in the front signing books. So thanks again.